Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. Can you imagine a king devoured by rats? Revenge against Enrique de Navarre is a dark and brutal story of the French religion wars. Discover the truth behind this final macabre. Subscribe and activate the bell so as not to miss anything. Imagine 16th century France for a moment. In the midst of religion wars, a divided kingdom, plunged into violence and uncertainty. In this context, the legend of Enrique de Navarre, a king wrapped in a mystery as dark as fascinating. His death, attributed to a pest of rats, a simple urban legend or truth after an undercover murder. The story will immerse you in this enigma, where reality is mixed with superstition, and the truth is hidden behind a layer of rumors and speculation. Legend has it that Enrique, after a series of political and religious controversies, found a terrible ending. It is said that he was devoured alive by a multitude of rats in his own castle. A grotesque image, macabre, which has gone down in history as a symbol of revenge, of divine punishment, or perhaps, simply, of the cruelty of the time. But what is true in all this? Is it just a story to scare, a myth born of uncertainty and fear? The truth, as usual, hides in the shadows. Historical records are scarce, contradictory, and often manipulated by political interests. Some historians point to a disease, others to poisoning, and others are inclined to the version of the rats, fed by oral tradition and popular legends. You, as a spectator, will have to decide what to believe, what version you think is more plausible. Prepare to enter a maze of stories, rumors, and assumptions, where the line between reality and fiction becomes increasingly blurred. But who really was Enrique de Navarre? You will wonder. He was an ambitious young man, heir to a complicated real line, a Huguenot in the middle of a mostly Catholic kingdom. His personality was an explosive mixture, cunning, calculator, but also capable of great samples of courage and charisma. His rise to power was not an easy path, full of intrigues, betrayals, and wars. From a young age, he had to deal with the complex political and religious situation of France. His ambitions were clear: to reach the throne of France. To do this, he had to navigate with skill for the turbulent waters of French politics, weaving alliances, betraying enemies and friends equally, according to his interests. He was not a man of inflexible principles, but a pragmatic who sought power above all. His conversion to Catholicism, although questioned by many, was a master play that opened the doors of the throne. His ability to change the side and his ability to adapt to circumstances, although questionable from a moral point of view, were key to their success. Enrique de Navarre was not a romantic hero, but a realistic politician, a man who understood the game of power and dominated him with mastery. His rise to the throne was the result of a long and careful strategy, where cunning and ambition combined to overcome their rivals. A king who knew how to use all the tools at his disposal to achieve his final objective. Imagine France in the 16th century. A country divided by religion, Catholics and Huguenots, the latter followers of Protestantism, faced each other in a brutal war that tore the kingdom. You, as a spectator, must understand that this conflict was not only a theological dispute, but a struggle for power, for the control of the throne and the future of France. Enrique de Navarre, our protagonist, was in the midst of this perfect storm. The political tensions were huge. The French monarchy, although powerful, was weakened by the constant civil wars. The nobility, divided between the two religious factions, constantly conspired, seeking to increase his power at the expense of the king. It was a dangerous game of alliances and betrayals, where loyalty was a scarce good and survival depended on cunning and strength. In this context of violence and distrust, Enrique de Navarre, being a Huguenot, was in an extremely vulnerable position. His own survival depended on his ability to navigate this sea of conflicts and betrayals. Every decision he made could have fatal consequences not only for him but for all those who supported him. You will wonder, who would want the fall of Enrique de Navarre? The answer is complex, an explosive mixture of political ambition and religious fanaticism. First, there were the most radical Catholics, those who saw in Protestantism a threat to the unity of France and the authority of the king. For them, Enrique, a Huguenot, was a heretic that should be eliminated. Prosody speak. Speak. The prosody rate equals 90%. But not only Catholics wanted their end. Within the French nobility itself, there were powerful families who saw in Enrique a threat to their interests. Ancestral rivalries, struggles for power and control of territories. Everything contributed to form a network of enemies that sought their destruction. The French court was a nest of vipers, where loyalty was a luxury that few could afford. Imagine the constant pressure, the betrayal stalking in each corner. Enrique had to navigate a sea of enemies, both religious and political, each with his own motivations and his own methods. Some conspired openly, others acted in the shadows, but they all shared a common goal: the elimination of King Huguenot. But was it really a pest of rats, or something more sinister? You will wonder if there was a conspiracy to end Enrique. Theories abound, and the truth, as usually happens in these cases, hides between shadows and rumors. Some point to the powerful family of the Geisa, enmistled with Enrique for religious and political reasons. It is speculated that they could have used their contacts inside the castle to facilitate the entry of rats or even to poison them. Others point to members of the French court, jealous of Enrique's growing power or simply eager to get rid of an uncomfortable rival. The rivalry between the different religious, Catholics and Huguenots factions also plays a crucial role. Imagine the palatial intrigue, the secret alliances, the whispers and the runners. A whole scenario of betrayal and mystery. The lack of forceful evidence further feeds speculation. Was it a carefully orchestrated plot, or a simple tragic coincidence? Perhaps the bubonic plague, present at the time, weakened Enrique and made him more vulnerable to the attack of rats. The truth, like an elusive mouse, escapes at our fingertips. The rats, however, fulfilled their macabre function. But where did that macabre story come from? The rumor of the rats, that grotesque image that pursues Enrique de Navarre, did not appear overnight. He was weaving little by little, like a spider web, with fear threads, intrigue and, above all, propaganda. Think of the time. Religious wars, conspiracies to the agenda, and a large number of people wanting to feed any theory that favored their interests. The first mentions, although indirect, appear in chronicles and private correspondences of the time. There was no talk directly about a plague of rats that devoured the king, but of a strange, sudden death with details that were magnified over time. Remember that information was traveling slowly, and everyone added their own speculation to the story, making it more and more monstrous. The spread of the rumor was rapid and effective, that he fed from uncertainty, morbidity, of the need to find an explanation to such an unexpected death. The legend expanded through the rumors in the Cortes, of the conversations in the taverns, and finally, through the printed leaves, although not always with the same version. Each narrative added a new macabre detail, a new twist to history. But what do the chronicles of the time say? There lies the difficulty. There is no official registration, a judicial sentence, or a document that confirms the history of rats. The sources that mention Enrique's death are ambiguous, full of rumors and exaggerations of the time. Some historians suggest that their death was due to natural causes, while others mention diseases or even a possible murder. The legend of rats, therefore, becomes a fascinating enigma. The lack of objective evidence forces us to carefully analyze the available sources. We have stories of chroniclers, private letters, and memories of the time, but these sources often reflect the political positions and ideological inclinations of their authors. That is, the history of rats could have been a form of propaganda, a way to discredit Enrique de Navarre, even after his death. Was it an invention to stain your memory? Remember that history is built from the interpretations of the facts. The legend of rats, then, is not only a horror story, but also a reflection of how historical narrative is manipulated and built. Critically analyzing the sources, we can better understand the context in which this macabre history arose and understand the weight of propaganda in the formation of collective memory. Does it make you think, right? But what role played rats in the life of the people of the time? Imagine a world without sewerage, with accumulated garbage in the streets and wooden houses. A feast for these rodents, which reproduced at incredible speed. They were carriers of diseases such as bubonic plague, typhus, and leptospirosis, authentic threats to public health that decimated entire populations. For you, the presence of these creatures meant fear, illness, and death. Prosody, speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%, beyond the disease. Rats also had a negative symbolism. They were associated with dirt, decline, and death. In many cultures, they represented evil, betrayal, or even heresy. Think about how terrifying it should be to see them invade your home. A symbol of a precarious and insecure life. where the line between survival and death was so fine. On the other hand, his role in medieval society was, ironically, more complex than you think. Despite their negative image, rats and their skins had a small economic value. They were used to make coats and other low-quality items. They were a part, although undesirable, of the medieval ecosystem. A constant reminder of the fragility of life and the struggle for survival in those difficult times. Imagine life in a medieval castle. You, as an inhabitant, share those stone walls with hundreds of people, animals, and, of course, rats. Lydrins, often simple holes on the ground, directly drain into the walls or pits. The garbage accumulated in dark corners, attracting these rodents like a magnet. Think of food remains, human and animals, a true banquet for rats. Personal hygiene was a luxury that few could afford. The water was scarce, and the soap a luxury article. The bathrooms were uncommon, and often the clothes were used during long unwashed periods. This lack of personal cleaning, added to the accumulation of waste, created an ideal environment for the proliferation of diseases and, of course, of rats. Can you imagine the smell? The kitchens of the castles, despite their apparent greatness, were dirty and disorganized spaces. Domestic animals, such as dogs and cats, freely wandered, sharing space with chefs, and food remains, the leftovers, often were exposed, creating a feast for rats, which moved incessantly between pots and pans. The wood of the castle, porous and old, offered countless holes and cracks so that the rats build their burrows. Imagine the constant stench, mixed with the smell of wet wood and decomposition in a medieval castle. The disease was a latent threat. You, as a simple inhabitant, share those walls with the plague, the typhus, the dysentery. A simple cut could mean a slow and safe agony. In an era where hygiene was a distant concept and medicine, rudimentary. Remember that King Enrique de Navarre, despite his power, was not immune. He, like you, lived in the midst of that pestilence. Its castle, although imposing, was a breeding ground for disease. His vulnerability was greater than he appeared. A simple epidemic could end him and his reign. Think about the lack of clean drinking water, in the precariousness of sanitary conditions. A plague outbreak was a death sentence for many, even for royalty. The king's vulnerability was not only a matter of enemies on the battlefield, but also of the invisible bacteria that swarmed around him within his own walls. Remember that stench. Now imagine finding the king. The discovery was frightening. The chroniclers talk about a disfigured body, root to the bone. It wasn't a natural death. That was clear. Rats, famous and numerous, had done their job with macabre efficiency. His real clothes, now andrajos, barely covered the remains of what was once a powerful man. Some stories mention the absence of the crown, a detail that adds mystery to the scene. Stolen, draged by the same creatures that devoured the monarch. The question remains, feeding the conspiracy theories that surround his death. The descriptions emphasize the violence of the attack, the ferocity with which the rats pounced on the body. Think about the visual impact. The crime scene, a macabre picture that even today, centuries later, is chilling. The chroniclers, witnesses or heirs of the stories, paint a brutal image, a slow and degrading death, an unworthy end for a king. The cruelty of nature, enhanced by negligence or perhaps revenge, looms over the scene. Remember that stench? Can you imagine what the autopsy should have been? If there was that time, forensic science was in diapers. Probably, what they found were the remains of a devoured body, with rodent teeth brands everywhere. The bones exposed and roid. A heartbreaking image, even for the most tanned eyes. Perhaps they tried to determine the cause of the initial death before the rat's party. If they examined the remaining organs, surely they did not find traces of poison or disease that explained such peculiar state. Death by starvation in a king was unlikely. Advanced decomposition would make any precise diagnosis difficult. Perhaps they only found evidence of the final butcher shop, the work of the rats, which were responsible for erasing any other trace. Prosody, speak. Speak, the prosody rate equals 90%. Think about the difficulty of determining the original cause of death. Murder? Disease? The evidence was literally roid. Forensic investigation, if it can be called that, must have been a finding of the obvious. A dead and devoured king. The rats were only the last chapter of a tragic story, a macabre end for an outcome already dark. But what really happened? The chronicles of the time are a true maze. Some say that Enrique de Navarre, your enemy, ordered his murder, others that was a conspiracy of the French nobility. There are those who speak of a disease, a natural death, but a natural death that ends a king devoured by rats. That is strange, right? The discrepancies are abysmal. Some stories describe a shattered, almost unrecognizable body. Others talk about a quick and almost clean death. How to explain these contradictions? Attempts to hide the truth, exaggerations to feed propaganda, or simply the lack of rigor in the information of that time. Think about the lack of technology, the absence of a forensic science like the one we know today. The descriptions depended on testimonies, often interested, and the interpretations of those who found the body. Each version, therefore, is a filter, a prism through which the truth is refracted, distorting it to it unrecognizable. The discovery of the body, devoured by rats, caused a major scandal. Would there be a trial? The chronicles are vague, but we intuit that popular pressure, in the face of such an atrocity, forced an investigation, although justice at that time was selective. Imagine the scene. The exonine body, the court gathered, the murmurs, the accusations thrown as poison darts, the French nobility, always eager for power, moved in the shadows, seeking guilty and protecting theirs. If there was a formal judgment, the details were lost in time. What we do know is that revenge, although late, came. Perhaps no Enrique de Navarre was condemned directly, his power was too great, but his allies, those who benefited from his dark maneuver, suffered the consequences. Fallen in disgrace, land confiscations, imprisonment, history was responsible for adjusting accounts, although partially and with the slowness that characterizes the justice of those times. You, as a spectator, can imagine the weight of the crown, the pressure of the nobility, the game of power that was hidden after the death of the king. Justice, or lack of it, leaves a bitter aftertaste in this story. And although the public trial is a mystery, revenge, although late and selective, became an echo of the initial injustice, a whisper in the corridors of power that still resonates between the stones of the French castles. So, who wanted Enrique de Navarre dead? The suspect list was long, but some names stand out. We start with the French nobles, many of them powerful and with reasons to desire their fall. Remember that the time was marked by the religious civil war, alliances constantly changed, and ambition was an unstoppable engine. Some saw in Enrique a threat to their power, others considered him a dangerous heretic. Then there were the members of the French royal family. The palatial intrigues were current currency, and the struggle for power could lead to anyone to commit desperate acts. Would there be anyone who saw Enrique as an obstacle on his way to the crown? The letters and correspondence of the time, if preserved, could reveal secrets. Analyzing them would be crucial. And we cannot forget the religious faction contrary to Enrique's. He was a Huguenot, and his Catholic enemies, powerful and numerous, had plenty of reasons to eliminate it. Remember the religious tensions of the time, violence and fanaticism that prevailed. For them, Enrique's death could be considered a holy action, a way to clean the land of heretics, who dared to act in the name of faith, but the church did not stay out. Imagine the propaganda machinery of the time, incendiary sermons that painted Enrique as a heretic, a danger to the Catholic faith. You could have heard stories of his alleged alliances with Protestants, exaggerated to the limit to feed fear and distrust. The pamphlets, printed in mass quantities, showed grotesque images of Enrique, distorting their figure to represent the evil incarnate. Rumors of pacts were disseminated with the devil, of human sacrifices, anything that could justify its elimination as a divine need. You, a simple citizen of the time, probably found these images and stories daily. The church, with its power and influence, molded public opinion, turning Enrique de Navarre into the ideal scapegoat. He was presented as a threat not only for the monarchy, but for the soul of France itself. Think about the weight of this narrative, how it could influence actions, even the decisions of those who sought to ascend in court or simply survive in such a convulsive environment. Prosody, speak. Speak. Prosody rate equals 90%. But think of the powerful enemies of Enrique de Navarre. His rise to power, his heresy in the eyes of many, wouldn't it be logical for their adversaries, after their death, would like to defame their memory further? The legend of rats, so grotesque, so degrading, could be a perfect tool to perpetuate hatred and contempt for a king who, even dead, remained a threat to his enemies. Imagine the propaganda that could be generated. A king, anointed by God, devoured by disgusting creatures. An image that resonated with the fear and superstition of the time. A revenge for his ambition, for his challenge to the church. Perhaps the legend is nothing more than an elaborate discredit campaign to ensure that its legacy will be stained forever. And the consequences? Think about the impact that this legend had on Enrique's historical perception. How long are there in it? How much is pure invention, a tool to consolidate the power of their enemies and delegitimize his reign, even in death? The legend, whether true or not, contributed to building a narrative that would last centuries. But his legacy, transcended infamy. Enrique de Navarre, turned into Enrique IV of France, marked a before and after. Imagine France torn by the wars of religion, a country mired in violence and distrust. His reign, despite his turbulent beginnings, brought with him a period of relative peace and consolidation. He knew how to weave alliances, looking for balance between the different religious factions. The Edict of Nantes, that cornerstone of religious tolerance, was his masterpiece. Think about its impact. An attempt to pacify the country, to establish a legal framework that protects the Hugues.it was not perfect, nor peace was absolute, but represented a giant step towards religious coexistence in a deeply divided Europe. His reign also promoted the French economy. The financial reforms that implemented laid the basis for a more prosperous future. Imagine a country rebuilding after decades of conflicts, a country that needed to heal its wounds. Enrique IV, with his pragmatism and his vision of the future, contributed decisively to that reconstruction. Its economic legacy is still relevant today, but his reign, even after his death, remained a political battlefield. The legend of its end, devoured by rats, was not a simple historical accident. It became a powerful weapon. Think about it. A king, a symbol of divine power, reduced to nowhere by disgusting rodents. Imagine the image, the propaganda that could be created from that sordid scene. The political enemies of Henry IV, those who sought to delegitimize their reign or that of their successors, took the most of this story. They spread it, they exaggerated her, they turned it into a tool to discredit her figure and her legacy. Can you imagine the pamphlets, the engravings, the stories that circulated, painting an image of decay and divine punishment? Historical manipulation was brutally effective. The image of a king devoured by rats, a symbol of corruption and failure, was recorded in the collective memory. They forgot or minimized their political achievements, their reforms, their effort to pacify the kingdom. Only the grotesque image remained, perpetuated by those who benefited from the distortion of truth. But what really say the chronicles of the time? You can imagine the difficulty. Information, filtered through the prism of religion wars, was loaded with propaganda. Each side painted the other as a monster, and Enrique de Navarre, with his ascension to the French throne, had many enemies who wanted to defame him. The story of his death, therefore, must be taken with tweezers. Was it a natural death? A murder? Or the most sensationalist version? An end devoured by rats? The Huguenots' chronicles, for example, rejoiced in the image of a just king killed by divine justice, while the Catholic chronicles preferred to omit the most rugged details, or even change them slightly to present a different image. Note how each version fits the political narrative of the moment. It is crucial for you to understand this bias inherent to historical sources. Analyzing the veracity of each source requires detective work. You must compare different stories, seek contradictions, and above all, understand the political and religious context in which they were written. Only then can you start separating the truth from fiction, the fact of myth, and in the case of Enrique de Navarre, the line between the two is as diffuse as the pestilence that, it is said, contributed to its end. /prosody, /speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. But let's go back to the images. How was Enrique de Navarre represented in the works of art of the time? Think of the official portraits. It was often shown with an imposing armor, symbol of its military power, but observes the details well. Sometimes, an expression almost of defeat or melancholy leaked in his gaze, a subtle contrast with the apparent force of his clothing. In anticipation of your tragic destination? In other representations, symbolism is more direct. Observe how color is used, dark and gloomy tones, contrasting with the bright colors of the royalty of their enemies, could prefigure their end. Was it a way of narrating your fall even before it happened? The allegories also played an important role. Look at the details in the minor elements that could reveal a hidden message. And finally, think of the images after his death. How was it represented then? Was he showed him as a victim, a martyr of religion wars, or as a weak king easy prey to his enemies. The interpretation of these images, often loaded with political propaganda, also tells us a lot about the way in which history is built and reinterpreted over time. The image, after all, can also be a powerful manipulation tool. But how did this story get to you? The legend of Enrique III and the rats did not arise from nothing. It was transmitted through generations. A whisper in the taverns, a chilling story around the fires. Imagine the peasants, speaking of him, of his so grotesque, feeding the myth with each repetition. The narrative was enriched with macabre details, with each story adding a touch of horror, of poetic justice, and so, from mouth to mouth, the story was extended, weaving a dark and enduring legend. But oral transmission was not the only way. The legend also found its way to writing. Chronicles, epic poems, including plays, collected history, although sometimes with variations. Some authors magnified her, others mitigated her, but all contributed to perpetuating the image of Enrique III as a king devoured by rats, an end that transcended historical reality and became a symbol. Thus, the story of Enrique III, of his turbulent reign and his end even more shocking, became a story that transcended time. From a historical fact, possibly exaggerated, a myth arose. A warning, perhaps, about the abuse of power, or simply a fascinating story, capable of captivating imagination through centuries. And you, what do you think? Is it just a legend, or is there anything else in the history of king devoured by rats? Think of other stories of kings swallowed by misfortune. Does the legend of Attila, the king of the Hunos, allegedly killed by a nasal bleeding during his wedding night? Although the cause of death differs, both stories convey a similar idea: the sudden and unexpected fall of a powerful monarch. The speed with which Enrique III's fortune vanished, just like Attila's, feeds the fascination with these legends. But the legend of Enrique III goes further. Remember the stories of kings killed by their enemies, such as Ricardo III of England, whose purpose became a legend. In the case of Enrique, the humble nature of his murderers, the rats, adds an extra element of cruel irony, turning his death into a metaphor of the fragility of power, even before such insignificant enemies. Have you wondered if the legend of Enrique III is an allegory? It could be interpreted as a warning about corruption and decline that can even undermine the most powerful kingdoms. The rats, in this context, could symbolize the betrayal and internal disintegration, while the death of the king represents the final collapse of a decomposition system. A parallel that resonates through many legends of fallen kings. But returning to Enrique de Navarre, his tragic death, devoured by rats, has transcended the story, becoming a persistent legend. Can you imagine? His story has inspired artists and writers throughout the centuries. Think of the possible literary representations, the vivid descriptions of its end, the oppressive atmosphere that has been reflected in the ink. You may find some historical novel that mentions it, a story that immerses you at the time of the French religion wars, with the image of the king agonizing, surrounded by hungry rodents. Visualize scenes full of tension, with details that make you feel the horror of the situation. What do you think if we are looking for concrete examples in works of art? Although it is difficult to find a direct and explicit representation in the mainstream cinema, the image of the king devoured by the rats has nurtured the imagination of many artists. Imagine a cinematographic, dark, and disturbing scene, which reflects the symbolic punishment that represents its end. Have you seen any movie that reminds you of this story, even if it is indirectly? /prosody. /speak. Speak, prosody rate equals 90%. The legend of Enrique de Navarre, beyond its possible historical veracity, has transcended as a symbol of the fragility of power and poetic justice. His influence on popular culture, although sometimes subtle, is undeniable. Think about the psychological impact of this image. The helplessness of a king before a pest of rats, a degrading and unexpected end. What suggests this powerful metaphor? But what really does the legend for us really mean? Beyond the morbidity, the story of Enrique de Navarre, devoured by rats, reflects the brutality and instability of the French religion wars. His death, so violent and degrading, became a symbol of chaos and revenge. Imagine the image. A king, symbol of power, reduced to rodent dam, an ignominious ending that speaks of the fragility of power. From a modern perspective, legend allows us to reflect on the construction of historical narrative. How long are there in it? How much is exaggeration and propaganda? Enrique's death could have been more prosaic, but the image of the king devoured by rats became a powerful metaphor, much more effective in transmitting the message of his fall and the triumph of his enemies. History also tells us about the importance of context. The religion wars were a period of extreme violence and fanaticism, where loyalty and betrayal were current currency. Enrique's legend, although probably exaggerated, fits this context of instability and brutality, reflecting the deep distrust and hatred that characterized the time. Think about it. How did the historical context influence the creation and perpetuation of this legend? But what really happened? Was it a natural death, undercover execution, or is the legend pure fantasy? The lack of detailed records and the propaganda of the time hinder the reconstruction of the facts. Imagine the uncertainty that surrounds this historical episode, the difficulty of separating the reality of the legend, the lack of reliable sources that give us a definitive answer. Historians face an enigma. Did Enrique de Navarre die for a plague of rats, a slow poisoning, or perhaps victim of a political conspiracy? Historical research becomes a search for clues into a maze of rumors, contradictions, and incomplete documents. Each piece of information found, every detail analyzed, is transformed into a new piece of the puzzle. You can participate in the investigation. Examine the available primary sources, seeks discrepancies, analyzes the political motivations of the time. Remember that history is not only a narrative of facts, but also an interpretation of them. What conclusions would you get from the evidences that exist today? Perhaps, with a new perspective, you can contribute to unraveling this historical mystery. Think about the image. A king, powerful and feared, reduced to a lot of bones roid by rats. That image, beyond real history, was recorded in the collective memory that it generated a visceral fear, a morbid fascination by the grotesque and the vulnerability of power. The legend became a warning story, a shadow that was projected on the monarchy and on those who ambitioned power. The mystery of his death, without a clear explanation, fed the legend. The lack of concrete responses allowed the imagination to do its work, creating a much more shocking narrative than any historical story. For you, what is more terrifying? A planned murder or the image of a slow and degrading death at the hands of rodents? From the psychological point of view, legend functions as a powerful archetype. It represents the fear of loss of control, decay and insignificance before death. It is a reflection of our own existential anxieties, projected in the figure of a king, someone who embodied power and invulnerability. The fascination exerted by the legend is based on the mixture of horror and mystery. It is a story that confronts us with the unpleasant, which we would prefer to ignore, but at the same time attracts us because of its exceptional character, by the paradox of a king, a symbol of power, defeated by something as insignificant as rats. That duality between repulsion and fascination is what makes history last. Think about it. A king devoured by rats. It is not just a violent death, it is a degradation, a total annihilation of its power and dignity. For you, what symbolizes that image? Perhaps the fragility of power, the inevitable decline even of the most powerful, or the relentless revenge of the oppressed. The story of Enrique de Navarre becomes an allegory, a visual metaphor that transcends the mere anecdote. The rats, small and repulsive, represent the forces that undermine power from below. The oppressed people, the silent rebellion, the corruption that carries the system from the inside. Enrique, in his greatness and cruelty, becomes the incarnation of oppression, and its end, a symbolic judgment, a punishment for their actions. Prosody, speak. Speak, the prosody rate equals 90%. Legend not only speaks of a physical death, but of a symbolic death of absolute power, of the king as a divine and untouchable figure. Its end, devoured by the most despicable creatures, suggests a poetic justice, a reminder that even kings can fall, and that history often has a way to balance the accounts. But what really is in all this? The legend of the king devoured by rats, although fascinating, needs a deeper analysis. Let's start with what we know. Enrique III of Navarre, a key character in the French religion wars, died in certainly mysterious circumstances. The historical records of the time, although scarce and often contradictory, offer us some indications. Diseases are mentioned, possibly a plague which hit the region. The description of his death, in some documents, coincides with the symptoms of a serious infectious disease, leaving space for speculation about intoxication or conspiracy. However, The lack of autopsy and inaccuracy of the writings of the time make any definitive conclusion difficult. The legend of rats is probably an exaggeration or a metaphor that was born from repulsion and horror at such a sudden and inexplicable death. The image of the decomposition and invasion of rodents could represent the fall of the king, the corruption of his power and the disintegration of his kingdom amid the chaos of religious wars. Remember that legends are often built on a real base, but deform it and magnify it over time. So how was his death really? Enrique III of Navarre, future Enrique IV of France, did not die devoured by rats. That grotesque image, so present in the black legend that pursues it, is an exaggeration, a metaphor perhaps, to represent the decline of its reign and its questionable popularity. The reality, although less spectacular, is much more complex and, in a way, more interesting. His death, in 1610, was due to a murder. Richelieu, still a cardinal of little influence, was not involved in the spell, but the palatial intrigue and religious tensions that marked their reign played a crucial role. The conspiracy, headed by the Catholic fanatic François Ravaillac, ended his life in a violent and sudden way, but not with the morbid theatricality of the legend. So, forget the image of rats. The real story, although it lacks spectacularity, reveals a turbulent era, full of conspiracies, ambitions, and religious struggles. The legend of King devoured by rats serves as an example of how fiction can sometimes eclipse the truth, even when it comes to a historical character as relevant as Enrique III of Navarre. So what really happened? The truth is much less spectacular, although equally tragic. Enrique III of Navarre, despite his reputation as a womanizer and his controversial political, died of natural causes. He suffered from a chronic disease, probably tuberculosis, which progressively weakened it. The hygiene conditions of the time, of course, did not help. Imagine a medieval castle with its immense spaces, its cold walls, and the lack of appropriate heating. The proliferation of rats in the castles was common, a problem inherent in the time. It is not unreasonable to think that, in its state of weakness, an infection or a bite of any of them could contribute to its decline. But the idea that he was devoured alive, that is clearly an exaggeration. Recall that the black legend was forged over the years, fed by the political rivalry and the intrigues of the court. In summary, Enrique III of Navarre died ill, probably of tuberculosis, in a context of precarious hygiene. The rats, present in any castle of the time, could have played a secondary role in their death, perhaps aggravating their condition. But the image of king devoured alive by rodents is a myth, an exaggeration that has been perpetuated throughout history, distorting the reality of its end. The real story, although less sensationalist, is equally fascinating. But the legend of the rats, where did it come from? It is a historical misrepresentation, one of those stories that adorned over time, adding macabre details to make it more attractive. The reality, although less exciting, reveals that Enrique III of Navarre was not devoured by rodents. His death, although premature and tragic, had a much more prosaic cause, although not less shocking. Historical precision forces us to correct these inaccuracies. The popular narrative, eager for the sensational, was responsible for exaggerating the facts, creating a distorted image of the king's death. The myth of rats probably arose as a metaphor for the decline and corruption that surrounded the French court at that time, an allegory of the political problems that afflicted the kingdom. Prosody. Speak. The prosody rate equals 90%. You can investigate and check the veracity of this information. There are numerous historical documents that confirm the real cause of the death of Enrique III of Navarre. Reviewing primary and secondary sources will allow you to understand the difference between legend and reality, between myth and history. Do not be fooled by sensational stories. The truth, although sometimes less attractive, is always more fascinating. But the story of Enrique de Navarre, beyond its possible end, transcended reality. It became a legend. A story that was transmitted from generation to generation, modifying and exaggerating over time. Think of how that image of the king devoured by rats, although false, has permeated popular culture. Have you ever listened to this story, perhaps in a book, a movie, or even a simple conversation? That image, that metaphor, has served to illustrate the idea of the fall of a powerful, the fragility of power and poetic justice, although in this case, completely invented. It is a perfect example of how a legend, however fantasy, can have a lasting impact in the way we remember and understand history. Have you ever wondered how such a dark fable is still alive? The legend of the king devoured by rats has not only endured, but has fed the imagination of artists, writers and filmmakers over the centuries. It has served as inspiration for works of art, literature and cinema, showing the fascination that violent death and revenge, although fictional, still exert over us. Do you think this legend will still live within 100 years? So, who ended Enrique de Navarre? The legend of rats, although poetic, is just that. A legend. Reality, as is usually the case, is more complex and less romantic. The chronicles of the time point to a conspiracy, a plot warned in the shadows of the court, where political ambitions and religious rivalries were dangerously intertwined. There is talk of poisoning, a furtive attack of a timely disease. There are several theories, all wrapped in the mystery. Some historians point to political enemies, powerful nobles who saw in their death an opportunity to ascend. Others blame the same religious enemies, who took advantage of instability to eliminate an uncomfortable rival. The truth, after the veil of time, has become elusive, an enigma wrapped in a mystery. You can decide which theory convinces you the most. Perhaps it was a mixture of everything, a lethal cocktail of ambition, religion and opportunity. What is certain is that the death of Enrique de Navarre marked a turning point in history, leaving a power vacuum that triggered new wars and conspiracies. His legacy, however, endures in the legends, in the stories that are counted around the fire, in the fascination that still awakens his mysterious disappearance. Surely you wonder, but how did Enrique de Navarre die? The truth is that there is no absolute consensus among historians. Some point to a conspiracy, others to a disease, and others to a cluster of circumstances that led to an end. The legend of rats, although fascinating, seems more a metaphor for the decline and corruption of the court than a literal description of the facts. I understand your doubt about historical sources. It is true that the chronicles of the time are often contradictory and partial, written from different perspectives and with hidden interests. Therefore, reconstructing complete history is a complex work that requires careful analysis of multiple documents and considering the limitations of each. And what about the revenge version? Many think that the legend of rats reflects a desire for poetic justice, a way of representing the punishment that history, or the people inflicted Enrique de Navarre. It is a way to simplify a much more tangled reality full of grays. Finally, the difference between legend and reality is crucial. The legend of rats, as I said, is a popular narrative that transmits emotions and a moral message. The historical reality, on the other hand, is based on the analysis of the available tests, although these are sometimes incomplete or contradictory. Both perspectives are important to understand the past. To get to the truth about the death of Enrique de Navarre, I have consulted a variety of primary and secondary sources. I started by the French National Archives, looking for contemporary chronicles and correspondence of the time. It was an exhaustive, but crucial task to understand the political and social context in which this mysterious event occurred. In addition, I leaned on the biographies of Enrique de Navarre, some written shortly after his death, others with more modern perspectives. Each one offered a piece of the puzzle, providing details about his personality, his enemies, and the circumstances of his reign. Comparing these different interpretations was fundamental for my research. Prosody, speak. A prosody rate equals 90%. I also explored recent academic works on French religion wars, paying special attention to historians about Enrique's death. These academic research allowed me to access more nuanced interpretations and a critical analysis of primary sources. Finally, I want to thank all researchers and historians whose work has contributed to this video. His research and publications have been the basis of my own research, and without them, this video would not have been possible. You can find detailed references in the video description, where I have included links to the most relevant sources. And we arrive at the end of this story, friend. But before saying goodbye, I want to deeply thank everyone who made this trip possible to the past.to researchers from the French National Archives, for their patience and invaluable help when you open the doors to key historical documents. His dedication to precision and detail has been fundamental for the construction of this story. I also want to express my gratitude to Dr. Annelise Dubois, an expert in the history of French religion wars, for her valuable contributions and corrections. His deep knowledge helped me avoid mistakes and enrich the analysis of the facts. Thank you, Annelise, for your time and your wisdom, and of course, to you, for being here, for dedicating your time to listen to this story. Your interest is the greatest reward for my work. Thank you for accompanying me on this trip through time, through the intrigue and darkness of the death of King Enrique de Navarre that I hope you enjoyed as much as I tell you. Finally, I cannot forget my edition and production team, who with their talent and dedication, have transformed this research into a captivating visual experience. Without them, this video would not be possible. Thank you all, but the story does not end there. Thanks to the collaboration of several historical archives, we have been able to access fascinating images and documents that complement our narration. You will see, for example, digital recreations of the letters that Enrique de Navarre and its enemies exchanged, revealing the political tension and fear that was breathed in court. Imagine the treacherous power game, the alliances that broke and formed, all with the latent threat of a religious war about to explode. In addition, we achieved high-resolution images of the time that show the architecture of the castles and cities where these events were developed. Look at the imposing strength where Enrique took refuge, his thick walls, narrow windows, everything evokes the atmosphere of uncertainty and danger. Think of the details, in the daily life of the people in the midst of that maelstrom of violence and intrigue. And finally, we have included some interactive maps that will allow you to follow the trace of military movements and political alliances. You can observe the advance and setback of the armies, visualizing the complex geography that influenced the development of war.it will be like being right there, participating in strategy and chaos. But the story of Enrique de Navarre and the rats is just the beginning. In future videos, we will deepen other dark episodes of the French religion wars. I will show you how ambition and betrayal wove a network of intrigues that changed the course of history. Get ready to meet even more fascinating characters and events as shocking as this. I am already working on a video about the San Bartolomé massacre, an event that left a deep scar in France. It will be a detailed analysis, with images and documents that will leave you breathless. And remember to subscribe to not miss any detail of this exciting historical saga. In addition, I have planned a special on the military strategies of the time, analyzing the most important battles and the key characters that directed them. I assure you that you will be surprised with the tactics and cruelty of the 16th century war. Do not forget to activate the bell of notifications to let you know when you upload new videos so you won't miss anything. I hope you liked this dark story. If you liked it, give like and subscribe for more. What do you think about revenge and justice? Leave it in the comments. /prosody/speak